Some women don't break hearts. They break confidence, clarity, and the very sense of self. You might think charm and affection are signs of love, but the most dangerous patterns are hidden, subtle, and almost impossible to spot until it's too late. Today, we're diving into the manipulations that quietly destroy men from the inside out, and what you need to recognize before you lose yourself. Emotional inconsistency functions as a powerful form of psychological conditioning because it directly targets the human nervous system rather than conscious reasoning. When affection, attention, or validation is delivered unpredictably, the brain interprets the relationship as unstable yet potentially rewarding. This activates the same reinforcement mechanism observed in variable reward systems, where uncertainty increases fixation rather than discouraging attachment. A man exposed to this pattern does not become stronger or more discerning over time. Instead, he becomes increasingly preoccupied with restoring emotional balance. The relationship shifts from mutual exchange to emotional pursuit, where stability becomes something to earn rather than something to expect. As inconsistency continues, self-perception begins to distort. The man gradually internalizes the instability as evidence of personal inadequacy, assuming that the fluctuating emotional climate reflects his performance rather than the other person's behavior. This internalization is critical because it redirects attention away from evaluating the relationship and toward self-correction. Effort increases, boundaries soften, and tolerance for discomfort expands. Emotional unpredictability becomes normalized, while consistent respect begins to feel unfamiliar or undeserved. At this stage, the man is no longer responding to the relationship itself, but to the anxiety it produces. The conditioning effect deepens when intermittent warmth is paired with emotional withdrawal. Moments of closeness feel intensified precisely because they are rare, reinforcing the belief that perseverance will eventually restore the earlier connection. This creates an emotional loop where relief becomes mistaken for intimacy. The absence of stability heightens emotional sensitivity, making the man more reactive, more accommodating, and less grounded in his own standards. Over time, decision-making becomes emotionally driven rather than value-driven, eroding clarity and self-trust. What makes this pattern particularly destructive is its subtlety. There are no explicit demands, no visible coercion, and no obvious conflict that signals danger. The damage occurs quietly through repetition. Emotional energy is redirected toward managing uncertainty, leaving little capacity for reflection or self-assertion. Confidence weakens not through criticism, but through constant emotional recalibration. The man adapts to volatility instead of questioning it, mistaking endurance for commitment and attachment for depth. This dynamic ultimately restructures the internal relationship a man has with himself. His emotional baseline becomes externally regulated, dependent on unpredictable validation rather than internal stability. Self-respect becomes conditional, tied to moments of approval rather than consistent self-alignment. When emotional inconsistency defines the relational environment, the cost is not simply dissatisfaction, but a gradual loss of psychological autonomy, where peace becomes rare and clarity feels permanently just out of reach. Victimhood becomes a powerful psychological tool when it is used not as a genuine expression of vulnerability, but as a consistent framework through which all relational conflict is interpreted. In such dynamics, emotional responsibility is subtly displaced. Every disagreement, misunderstanding, or boundary discussion is reframed as an attack rather than a dialogue. This framing immediately shifts the man into a defensive position where the focus moves away from the issue itself and toward repairing emotional damage he is implied to have caused. Over time, this pattern trains him to associate honesty with harm and silence with peace. As the victim narrative solidifies, accountability gradually disappears. The woman's emotions are treated as immutable facts, while the man's emotional responses are treated as problems to be corrected. When he expresses discomfort or dissatisfaction, the conversation quickly centers on her pain, her past wounds, or her emotional sensitivity. This redirection is not accidental. It ensures that the original concern remains unresolved while simultaneously positioning him as morally responsible for her emotional state. The relationship ceases to be a space of mutual responsibility and becomes one-sided emotional labor. Guilt plays a critical role in sustaining this dynamic. The man begins to preemptively suppress his needs to avoid triggering emotional distress. Boundaries that would otherwise be healthy and reasonable are reframed as cold, unempathetic, or emotionally negligent. Over time, he internalizes the belief that prioritizing himself is inherently harmful. This internal conflict weakens self-respect and creates chronic emotional tension, as his internal needs remain unmet while his external behavior becomes increasingly accommodating. The long-term psychological cost of this pattern lies in identity erosion. When a man repeatedly sacrifices authenticity to maintain emotional equilibrium, he loses clarity about what he actually feels and wants. Self-censorship becomes habitual. Emotional expression becomes filtered and strategic rather than honest. The relationship may appear stable on the surface, but internally, it is sustained by fear of guilt rather than mutual understanding. Emotional safety is replaced by emotional management. This form of manipulation is particularly damaging because it masquerades as sensitivity and depth. It discourages direct confrontation by moralizing emotional discomfort. The man is not explicitly told he is wrong. He is made to feel wrong. Over time, this distinction becomes invisible, yet its effects are profound. The capacity to assert needs, maintain boundaries, and trust one's emotional judgment steadily diminishes, leaving the man psychologically constrained within a dynamic he feels responsible for maintaining but powerless to change. Control that disguises itself as care operates through emotional plausibility rather than force, which is why it often goes unnoticed in its early stages. It begins with attentiveness, concern, and an expressed desire to protect the relationship. Questions about whereabouts, preferences, and decisions are framed as interest rather than surveillance. At first, this feels validating. Over time, however, these inquiries shift subtly from curiosity to expectation. Choices that once felt neutral now seem to require explanation, justification, or emotional reassurance. As this pattern deepens, autonomy becomes conditional. The man learns that certain decisions provoke tension, disappointment, or emotional withdrawal, while others maintain harmony. Without explicit rules ever being stated, he adapts his behavior to minimize friction. This adaptation is not conscious submission, but emotional optimization. He begins to anticipate reactions, adjust plans, and limit actions not because he agrees, but because emotional resistance feels exhausting. Control succeeds when compliance feels like the easiest path to peace. What makes this dynamic particularly effective is its moral framing. Restriction is presented as investment, and obedience as emotional maturity. When the man resists or asserts independence, his behavior is reframed as distance, selfishness, or a lack of commitment. The issue is no longer the control itself, but his perceived failure to prioritize emotional closeness. This reframing creates internal conflict, where asserting independence feels equivalent to harming the relationship. Over time, the man associates self-direction with guilt. The psychological impact extends beyond the relationship itself. As personal space contracts, external anchors such as friendships, goals, and routines weaken. The man's sense of identity becomes increasingly relational rather than self-directed. Confidence erodes not through criticism, but through dependency. Emotional approval becomes the reference point for decision-making, replacing internal judgment. This shift reduces resilience and increases emotional reliance, making separation or resistance feel disproportionately threatening. The most concerning aspect of control masked as care is how it distorts the definition of love. Love becomes equated with access, monitoring, and emotional influence rather than respect and trust. The man may feel chosen and important, yet simultaneously constrained and diminished. Because the control is subtle and emotionally justified, it rarely triggers alarm. Instead, it gradually normalizes a reduced version of the self. As this pattern continues, the man may struggle to recognize where his preferences end and emotional accommodation begins. The loss is not immediate or dramatic, but cumulative. Psychological freedom gives way to emotional management, and personal authority is quietly replaced by relational permission. The relationship persists, but the cost is a steady withdrawal from one's own direction, instincts, and sense of inner command. The truth is, danger doesn't always come with aggression. It often comes with charm, care, and the illusion of love. The strongest men aren't those who endure manipulation. They're those who see it, set boundaries, and refuse to surrender their inner authority. Awareness is power, self-respect is non-negotiable, and emotional freedom is the ultimate protection. If you want, I can seamlessly integrate these hooks into your full script, so it reads perfectly from start to finish, Psyche Depths style. Do you want me to do that?